All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. This day is brought to you by Progressive. Are you driving your car or doing laundry right now? Podcasts go best when they're bundled with another activity. Kind of like Progressive home and auto policies. They're best when bundled too. Having those two policies together makes insurance easier and could help you save. Customers who save by switching their home and car insurance to Progressive save nearly $800 on average. Quote a home and car bundle today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $793 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2021 and May 2022. Potential savings will vary. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This is part 2 of a 3-part series we're doing all week, looking at Black History Month and the questions about how Black history has been studied, celebrated, and evolved in this country. Last episode, as you may remember, was about Carter G. Woodson, who started Negro History Week in the 1920s, which has evolved into Black History Month. So listeners, you will note a shift there from week to month, but also from the word Negro to the word Black. And that is kind of what we're going to get into today, this really fascinating, contested, and complicated history of the terminology around Black Americans, from colored to Negro to African American to Black. There's a number of other terms circling around there as well. But as you may have noticed, there's also now a conversation breaking out about the capitalization of the word Black. And this, of course, plays out in academia, in media, in popular culture. And our guest for this episode is someone who resides in all of those worlds, Jelani Cobb, back on the show, staff writer for The New Yorker, professor at Columbia, co-editor of The Matter of Black Lives, The New Yorker's anthology of writings on race, and someone, I should add, who responded to my email asking him to come on for this topic within like 2 minutes saying, oh, I have thoughts on this. So, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And of course, with us, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Kellie Carter-Jackson, host the forthcoming Oprahdemics. I got to keep saying that. Anyway, but
we'll plug it in.
Yeah, exactly. So, look, lots of history to go through here, and I do want to sort of walk through some of the history. But Jelani, you want to start now in this present? I don't know. You write for The New Yorker. Has The New Yorker updated their style guide? Are they capitalizing Black?
They are, and I should say we are. And I understand the decision, the logic of the decision that went into that. But I'm one of those people who has personally opposed capitalizing the B in Black. And I literally just talked to my students about this. And it is because we typically reserve the status of proper noun, for things that exist, the categories that exist. And race doesn't exist. And so in capitalizing Black, as opposed to it being a modifier or an adjective, we've now turned it into a discrete category, which tends to point to race or to treat race as an actual identity. And when people say like, oh, this is more a matter of respect, or this is a matter of kind of recognizing, cultures and communities, and I would say, sure, but I don't understand how Black gets you closer to that than African American does. a term which actually includes the word Africa in it. And so that's an argument that, is popular with grammarians and no one else. Because if I, raise that at my family reunion this summer, I'm going to tell you that my old aunties are going to be like, this boy has lost it,
But when you work for the New Yorker, I think getting on the good side of the grammarians is often a good tactic.
Job requirement.
So Kellie, I'm curious where you're at on this, but also I want to point out to listeners, you recently tweeted and said, very humbly, you were like, hey, folks, what are we doing here? What are we treating here?
What are we doing?
Yeah, and so
what are we doing?
I want to acknowledge that this is complicated and people are figuring it out in real time.
Absolutely. I mean, so I'm also in the process of writing another book, and I noticed that half of my chapter is Black lowercase, and then the other half is sprinkled Black uppercase, and I'm like, you need consistency. But I feel my training was at Columbia, and I trained under Barbara Fields, who was a stickler for language,
Mm-hmm.
and she, let all of us know that Black was an adjective, and that we shouldn't make it a proper pronoun, and you would never say two talls walked into a bar, that doesn't make sense. And that when we turn Black into an adjective or an adjective into a pronoun, that we rob people of their humanity. We rob them of the ability to see them as people. And so I always stuck with the lowercase b because it felt like it made sense, and it also was a part of Chicago manual style, which I had to use when I was writing academically. But now I feel conflicted. And I sort of go with wherever the publisher wants, but I'm still wedded to lowercase b.
It's also interesting that we're seeing this iteration of this debate with Black, which is the same debate that happened with Negro, which means the same thing. And when we looked at, the word Negro being written with a lowercase n, which it was for a very long time, in that instance, now, the word Black having a lowercase b is not tied to any direct attempt to stigmatize people of African descent, but the lowercase n in Negro absolutely was. And so you see at the turn of the 20th century, people arguing for the capitalization of the n in the word Negro, and then a kind of nationalist resurgence. There's a book by Richard B. Moore called Negro, the origin of the name and its evil use, or some such. And he makes the case, that Negro, which is, the Spanish word for Black, is not who we are. And there's really effectively no distinction between Negro and the other N term that has been applied. And they are. I mean, the NIGGER word is just a corruption of the Spanish and Portuguese word for Black. Mm-hmm. And so we are really having this grammatical conversation, but it's much more a philosophical conversation about who we are and what kind of terminology best connotes, I guess, a proper respect for our humanity.
I want to get to some of that history and walk through it. But one more thing on this sort of current debate about capitalization. I mean, what is your sense of why the push for capitalization is happening right now? What is it about a lowercase b in Black that feels inadequate to some people who are pushing for capitalization?
Well, no, I think that the sense is it doesn't correspond with how people understand themselves. So they understand Black to be the signifier of the group they belong to. And it's a group that has been stigmatized, that still suffers from social disparities and economic disparities and so on. And having had our humanity diminished in so many different ways over such long periods of time, that capitalizing the B in the term by which we refer to ourselves makes a statement about who we are as people. And I think that my objections are a footnote saying, yes, but you also reify race in a way that, scholars would be aware of, but probably the lay public wouldn't really necessarily care about. But I think it's an understandable impulse.
I worked on the notes on the AP Style Guide, which we published with the Field Guide on White Supremacy. And there's a related conversation that gets exactly at that essentialization that you're talking about, which is the debate that sprung up at the same time about whether or not to capitalize the word white. And as people who worked on white supremacy, we were like, you know who capitalizes the W in white?
Right.
White nationalists and white power activists and neo-Nazis. And yet, where I work at CNN, they capitalize both black and white. And I sort of shudder every single time that I see it written that way. But that's the way those things are related, I think, helps to bring out your point about that essentialization that happens.
Yeah, it's like when people went from referring to these United States to the United States, and the kind of simple change in the article made a sense. This had this huge implication about thinking of the United States as a unitary, single, solitary entity. And I think that we don't necessarily think about, and it's the worst kind of metaphor, as we are seeing these racial polarities emerge and have so much more power and so much more salience, that we capitalize B and we capitalize W as a means of adopting these ultimately racially nationalist positions without thinking about what the implications are.
Do we want to go through a little of the history here, which I think will sort of help echo some of these other moments? I mean, we have, and the other interesting thing is the different spheres in which all of this is taking place. And certainly the census is a huge part of this. And I'm curious whether, we should think of census as more a reflection or driver of the change in language. But, the census moved from not really acknowledging race, first acknowledging, free and slave, and then including white, black, mulatto. And then in 1850, the term color came in. And then, in the 20th century, there was this shift from color to negro as an option you could choose, and then race, and then color or race in the 90s. But, even until 2000, black, African American, or Negro was in the census all the way until the year 2000.
2013, the census removed Negro last week. I don't know. It only feels like a couple years ago when it's really 10.
My joke about this was that I'm of mixed ancestry. My parents were colored and black with several Negroes in my ancestry there too.
You just checked every box.
And all of that turned into an African American. And so, it's so funny how genes work.
But the inclusion of the category as black, African American, or Negro all the way until 2013 just seems like someone was just not confident enough, and so they said, well, let's just put everything on the same line and just have that be a check box. So, I mean, what do we think? Does it matter what the census form says? Is that significant?
Yeah, I don't think that the census necessarily, and maybe you'll disagree, Kellie, given that they didn't get rid of the word Negro until 2013, it does seem to be a lag indicator rather than on the cutting edge here. But I think it also speaks to how much and in a certain way how quickly language changed, because somebody who might have been filling out the census in 1940 might still be filling it out in the year 2000. And not that they would be confused by the category changes, but the government wants some consistency in how it records people by, this term has changed to, race or color. And I think that might be why that term lingered for so long.
What's interesting about the census also, I did some genealogical research in my family, and I found that my grandparents, my father's parents, in the 1920 census were listed as mulatto. And in the 1930 census, they were listed as Negro. And so this was entirely arbitrary. And I was talking to my cousin about this, and I said, there's this transition, because my grandfather and grandmother were very light complexioned people. And there's this transition between how they were categorized. And she said, well, why would they be mulatto in 1920 and Negro in 1930? And I said, my guess is that the Great Depression hit and we got demoted. And I was like, but in reality, it kind of points to the arbitrary nature of this, that it was simply somebody who came to the door, looked up, said, oh, these are mulattoes, and a different person who came to the door a decade later and said, these are Negroes.
And so then what about in kind of within the Black community? I mean, you can trace sort of, Black organizations. I mean, we haven't even talked about the term African, right? We're talking about AME churches, right? Including that word African in there as well. But, the NAACP still has the word colored in its name. But in terms of some of the shift in the history, I mean, no surprise, a lot of these changes happen in eras where just there's bigger conversations about race breaking out. It's no surprise it's happening now, and it's no surprise a lot of these changes happened in the 60s. But any thoughts on that, on the shift in the 60s in particular, and it seemed like a pretty contested shift from Negro to Black to African American, all happening really kind of in the 60s into the 70s, and people sort of breaking out into different camps?
It's interesting. There's Ethiopian in there too. Very early on in the 18th century, you have people. I'm pretty sure Benjamin Banneker referred to himself as Ethiopian at some points. And there are various instances where Black people refer to themselves, because Ethiopia was often, as we all here know, often used to refer to the whole continent. And then just the unalloyed, unmodified African, which people used. But I think that that transition from colored to Black was meant to be a matter of self-determination, but because Black was so derogatory as a term prior to that, was considered an insult if you referred to somebody as Black, then in a way that's not entirely distinct from the way that queer went from being a pejorative to being a term that people would apply to take and reorient and use as a form of nomenclature that they felt people feel empowered by. The same thing, I think, happened with Black in the 1960s. We had a Black Power movement. It just wouldn't have the same ring as a colored power movement. And so I think that like what happened with Black was so connected to like the aesthetics of the era and, the change of temperament and afros and dashikis and all those other kinds of things. I think it became a kind of stand-in they needed a new word to summarize this new consciousness that was emerging.
Well, and say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud. It's just rhythmically a lot better.
Right. Yeah. I mean,
a lot more things rhyme. A lot more things rhyme with Black. I get what you say. But no, I mean, to put a finer point on that shift, I mean, in 1968, there was a Newsweek poll. More than 2/3 of Black Americans still preferred the term Negro. And by 1974, that had basically flipped. So we're talking about 5-6 years there. And I think that culture has a huge part in it.
There's something that I've also noticed that the diaspora, so that oftentimes when I'm talking to other Black people that are Jamaican or Haitian or Nigerian, there is a need to sort of say, to sort of distinguish between the two groups. People have always been like, wait, what's a Black American? And I'm like, someone that's Black and lives in America. Like, I'm trying to from Haitians or from like, people who are Senegalese, but that sort of like, diversity is something that never gets talked about.
And I also think that happens as a kind of function of like strained intergroup relationships, because lots of people, so I grew up in Queens, which is, heavily West Indian community when I was growing up. And there was always this way that people would talk past each other. People would say, I'm not Black, I'm Jamaican, or I'm not Black, I'm Trinidadian. And the West Indian person saying that was making a statement about nationality. And the Black American person saying that was making a statement about race. And they were like, yeah, but you're still Black. And they'd be like, well, no, I'm Jamaican. And so for them, Black meant specifically American. And it was a kind of, I think even an ongoing kind of thing that you'll hear people, because it often is read as an unwillingness to be associated with Black Americans or an attempt to distinguish between your cultural background and our cultural background. When in fact that I think it is it would make sense that a Jamaican or a Trinidadian or a Bahamian would lead with their national identity, whereas I think the complicated and tortured relationship of identity in Black people in the United States has made it such that there's this kind of asterisk attached to it.
One thing that I'm curious about is whether there is a political vector to this around Black Lives Matter and it as a response to police violence, that you have all of these gradations in communities and all of this diversity in communities, but when you are being looked at through the lens of law enforcement, you're all Black, and that there is there's a political statement being made there about a sort of the way that law enforcement sees Black people just in general and doesn't differentiate.
And I think also it's like the best example of this was Barack Obama, because when it became clear that he was going to become president, there was a whole tide of people going, but why is he Black? He's biracial. And it was like Frederick Douglass was like, as if, because this idea of being biracial had not been mutually exclusive to the idea of being Black. But there have been kind of points at which we parse out the distinctions and points at which we don't. And so when going back to the West Indian example, when we look at those marquee examples of police shootings, especially in New York, a lot of those people are of Caribbean ancestry. Amadou Diallo was of West African ancestry. And, the common dynamic there was their skin color, and they were being treated as Black people, per se, by the police. Abner Louima, which in the 90s was Haitian American. And so I think that there's that part of it. At the same time, I'm mindful that there is a dialogue that people utilize when they're trying to make cultural pathology arguments about Black Americans, where it's important to say, well, the children of Black immigrants do really well on these standardized tests, or they're disproportionately represented at the Ivies, or any of those things. And so it's kind of duplicitous, in the way that people can be grouped together or pulled apart according to what's most politically advantageous.
Can I take us to December of 1998, where in Chicago, Jesse Jackson gives a press conference and proclaims that Black people no longer want to be called Black people, they want to be called African American, which you can share your thoughts on Jesse Jackson deciding to do that, but also, certainly a significant moment, and actually, really breaks out a really big conversation. I want to read one quote sort of in response to that and then get your thoughts. But a lot of older, I would say, Black Americans sort of dismissed this and said, there are more important things to have conversations about. And we've been through a bunch of name changes before. The Reverend Herbert Martin of Chicago said, quote, "We must have really reached the zenith in the civil rights struggle that we now have to busy ourselves with semantics." So that was his response to Jesse Jackson. But what do you make of that moment?
I mean, this is also when you get to see a lot of name changes. So when I think about, the Journal of Negro History becoming the Journal of African American History, or I think about, even ASALH has changed its name from the Association of the Study of African Americans in Life and Culture, I think, or History. I'm botching the name. But like, there's been
they're gonna call you out for that. You know that.
That's right.
I know. I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry.
Expect emails.
But you did see a lot of name changes in the 90s and even early 2000s of people trying to have a more quote unquote progressive outlook about this, but I still wholeheartedly believe that a lot of people see them as synonymous and interchangeable. And I know I, for one, use African American and Black, not so much colored, but I use these ideas, or these words all the time. And I don't think much about it when I do it.
Well, what's funny that I use these terms in very distinct contexts. If I am writing a report about diversity or something, I will say Black or African American. If I'm writing in the New Yorker, I will say Black or African American. If I am talking to my friends about other Black people, I refer to us as colored and Negroes.
Yeah.
And so, but it's meant ironically and, affectionately. And so, if I'm going someplace and I'm like, I don't know, are any Negroes going to be there? Well, I'll be the only Negro, And so I would say it like that, but it's kind of a kind of inside joke.
But can I ask you this, Jelani, because I know we both have small children. My daughter, who is 4, about to be 5, she refers to herself as brown. And I don't correct her because I'm like, I don't know, there's an innocence there that I feel like the moment I start like reinforcing black or like these strict racial lines, like it's all over. And now we got to talk about things that I'm not ready for her to understand just yet. But even my son will say things like, hey, there was another brown boy at school today. Or, you know, there's someone who's brown like me. And I'm like, yeah, there is. But, you know, I wonder if the way we talk to children is different as a way to preserve that sort of innocence about what is black and what is brown.
Yeah, I think so. And it's funny that you would bring this up because literally in the past week, we had like this moment with her where her teacher told her that, you know, February is Black History Month. And she like literally looked at her hand and said, hey, I'm black. And another black girl in her class said, I'm black too. And another little girl whose parents are Indian American lifted her hand and said, I'm brown, you know? And then they all like high-fived each other. And it was like, I don't really like know like what that was about. But then it was just a kind of, hey, we're in this group. And, you know, I've been reluctant to impose any kind of narrative about Black identity, you know, or to introduce her to any kind of narrative of it. Like she'll eventually learn about slavery and learn about racism and all the tremendous things that have been achieved, but the adverse circumstances under which they were achieved. And there's that whole part of her identity that I want her to be clear about, but I don't want to do that in a heavy-handed way. And so it's been kind of letting her see, and like she knows her community, she knows her family, she knows that, you know, her grandfather came from Jamaica, but her father's family is her maternal grandfather, but her paternal family is from the South and the United States, and, you know, those kinds of things, which I think are important. But I at least have been hesitant to make it more explicit than that. I want to let her kind of put these things together for herself a little bit.
Yeah, I agree.
Oh, but can I tell you one other thing though? This is like, sometimes that goes awry, because seriously, we had a conversation. I don't remember how it came up, but it was kind of natural part of the conversation. And I told her there used to be these schools and only Black people went to some schools and only white people went to other schools. And she went to school the next day and told her friends that she is going to a new school and only the Black kids can go. And it's like, yeah, that wasn't it. So, you know, and then especially this is like a very touchy-feely, multicultural kind of school, and like she's just come in like, oh, your child joined the Nation of Islam. We don't know what happened.
Incredible. Yeah, I mean, you know, raising kids is really hard, and then this stuff just on top of it, you know. Yeah.
Can I bring up another political moment? When Donald Trump was on the campaign trail and started referring to Black people as the Blacks, I also noticed that people would do the same thing in a joking, like as a jest, you know, like, oh yeah, the Blacks this or the Blacks that. But then I also feel like I have to push back in my students' papers when they say things like Blacks. I'm like, no, Black people, Black residents, Black citizens, like, you know, like, let's be more specific. But I noticed that this kind of slippery or sloppy language has also weaved its way into the public vernacular in ways that I'm not always comfortable with, how that loss of a pronoun or that loss of humanity like reinforces ideas of either anti-Blackness or inferiority. And that's something that...
And also, I mean, like slaves and enslaved Americans, you know, or enslaved people. Right. I mean, yeah, that language and just kind of that basic, like, are you talking about a person first and foremost?
Yes. And I just found out we're no longer doing fugitive slaves. Now it's freedom seekers. And so I'm like, oh, okay. Like, you know, academically, we're constantly pivoting with the language that we use.
I want something better than freedom seekers, though. That sounds like State Department language for a ethnic group that we're supporting this week, but probably going to screw over next week.
Well, that's not that far.
Not inaccurate.
So Harriet Tubman wasn't a freedom seeker.
I mean, I'm just going to say, we're going to find another term for Harriet. Like the embattled ethnic minority of freedom seekers in name country. You know? Also, I think there's one other thing that, to your point about the blacks, which is that you almost never hear anything humanizing that comes out of putting an article in front of an ethnic group. Like if you say the Jews, there's like a 99% that something anti-Semitic is going to follow that.
Yes. Yes.
and even like unwittingly anti-Semitic, you know, it's like, or the blacks. It's not like the blacks are awesome. It's going to be something that's really not. It's not going to be great once you have the article in front of black.
True.
Yeah. Look, this stuff is very complicated, but there are also some very clear lines.
Right.
And some very clear demarcations. Like, don't do that.
Linguistic red flags.
Yeah, exactly. Now, before we go, I mean, I just want quick thought. You know, let's come back to the capitalization of black. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'll ask you to make a prediction. I mean, is it going to stick? Where do you see the winds changing? I mean, 10 years from now, will that be the standard?
Unfortunately, I think so. You know, I think that once we make a move like this, it's harder to move backward or to go back to the status quo ante. And irrespective of the reasons and the well-reasoned arguments for not capitalizing it, I don't think that, you know, that will appeal to very many people.
Yeah, I agree. I think we're on a slippery slope toward capitalizing black, white, brown,
Right.
all ethnicities.
Right.
And what we saw was a big institutional change, right? That the style guides of all of these media institutions changed, and changing them back, you would have to persuade a huge number of people. And I think that it's just a tricky thing to do.
Yeah.
The other side is that I'm starting a new school that only people with an uppercase B, black, can go to. So
your daughter will be happy.
Yeah, my daughter will be happy.
There you go. All right. Well, we'll leave it there. This has been incredibly fascinating. Jelani, thank you so much for coming back on the show and for helping us talk through this. Jelani Cobb, Columbia University co-editor of The Matter of Black Lives, which is the New Yorker's anthology of writings on race, and of course, lots of other many wonderful things. So thank you for doing this.
Thank you. It's been real.
Yeah. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. If you feel like you're wasting time and money with your current business software, or just want to know what you could be missing, then you'll need to join the millions of others who have switched to Odoo. Odoo is the affordable, all-in-one management software with a library of fully integrated business applications that help you get more done in less time for a fraction of the price. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday. Odoo, modern management made simple.
Radiotopia. From